Okay, hello year 8. So this is lesson 3 of your scheme of work on the Haitian Revolution. Okay, now if you remember last lesson, we were looking at um, the reasons why Sandeman, which is now called Haiti, why it was considered the pearl of the French Empire. Okay, so we looked at that before the Haitian Revolution, the reason Sandeman was so important to France was that it was the wealthiest colony in the world. Remember, a colony meaning an area under the control of another country or empire. Okay, so Sandeman slash Haiti was a really important colony to France's empire, and the reason for that was that it produced 45% of the world's sugar and 50% of its coffee. Okay, so it made it the most valuable colony in the entire world at that point to France. Okay, we also looked at the idea that it created more than 1 million jobs in France in the docks, unloading and processing the sugar, and also lots of the wealthiest and most influential people in France had investments in the trade with Saint-Domingue. Okay, we also looked though at the fact that this wealth that came from Saint-Domingue slash Haiti um, was based upon a really vicious system of slavery. Okay, there were 500,000 slaves, enslaved Africans in Haiti in 1790, the year the Haitian Revolution started. We also saw that it was so violent in Saint Domingue slash Haiti that 50% of the slaves would be dead within 3 years of arrival. Okay, so last lesson we looked at the idea that crucial background to the Haitian Revolution is it was part of France's empire as a colony. It made it lots of money for its coffee and sugar exports, but that wealth was based upon a really vicious exploitative slaving system. Okay, now we're going to look at the actual start of the Haitian Revolution next lesson, but what we're going to do today is look at the background of the social structure in Haiti before its revolution began. Okay, so we're going to look at how society was structured because that's going to help us understand how the Haitian Revolution came about. Okay, now the title for today's lesson is How Did the Rights of Man Undermine the Aristocracy of the Skin? Now, we're going to unpack that title fully later on in the lesson, but what we're going to be looking at today is how the French Revolution, when it began, influenced events in Haiti. Okay, so how did the ideas associated with the rights of man, about equal rights, about being against privilege, how did that affect the society in Haiti slash Saint Domingue at the time? Okay, now we're going to start off with a quick painting. Now, there's a section of a painting by a guy called Agostino Brunias from the 18th century Caribbean. Okay, so sort of a few decades before the Haitian Revolution. Now, I would normally do this with like a class discussion, but I want you just to go through bit by bit and let's just look at some of the details in this painting. They're going to really help us think about the social structure in Saint Domingue at the time. Now, if we look at this woman here, some of her features, what kind of woman would we say that she probably is? Now, some of you probably noticed, well, she's probably quite wealthy because she's wearing quite well-designed kind of clean white dress. The hat she's wearing probably suggests she's quite high class as well. So we can probably tell she's some sort of aristocrat or, she's got some kind of high social status. Now, this is a picture from another part of the painting. Now, have a think for a sec. Do you think that this woman is higher or lower status than the previous one? Let's have a look at the painting. Now, I think a few of you probably guess what she's probably lower class than the woman we just saw before because of the sort of bonnet she's wearing, that she looks like some kind of worker. A lot of students often pick out with this one that she's probably some sort of nanny because the child she's carrying clearly has a different ethnicity to herself. So she's probably some kind of house worker, so probably a nanny or carer of some kind. Now, there's a couple of things in this painting though which are a little bit surprising, and one of the biggest ones is this woman in the middle here. Now, just have a think for a sec. Does anything stand out for her compared to the other people around her for you? Now, I think a few of you probably noticed, well, she's kind of interesting because she's almost in the middle a little bit between these two groups of people. Now, you clearly got these much darker skinned women over here who probably look like domestic servants because of the kind of like clothes that they're wearing. Okay. We've got these white women over here who are wearing, again, very fancy dresses, fancy hats. And this woman's interesting because she's clearly got better clothes on than these women over here do, but her complexion is clearly darker than these women over here. Now, the reason for that is that in Saint Domingue before the Haitian Revolution, there were 500,000 black African slaves. There were 31,000 whites, but then there were 28,000 people in this middle group of people who were called the free coloreds. Okay, now the free coloreds in Saint Domingue were interesting because they were kind of a middle group between the white slave owners and the black African slaves. They would usually be the product of either relationships between middle class black females in Saint Domingue with white aristocrats, or sometimes they would be the result of rapes from the white slave owners of their African slaves. But the free coloreds in Saint Domingue were interesting because they had a lot more rights than the Africans did, and they played quite an important role in the beginning of the revolution in Saint Domingue. So this is a what we call social hierarchy. Okay, so we talked about earlier in the year the idea of a social hierarchy. Okay, so a system of power with people at the top with more status and power, and then you go further down and you end up with the people with the least at the bottom. So we think about the school, we've got at the bottom of the social hierarchy you guys, you're the students. Okay, you've got the least power even though you're the most people. You've then got above that probably teachers, and then above that you've got heads of year, and then above that you've got SLT, and then at the very top of the pyramid you'd have the head teacher. Okay, so just like that, there is a hierarchy in Saint Domingue before the revolution there begins. And the way it goes is that there's a couple of key things to point out. So you start at the very bottom with the field slaves. Okay, so these are the African slaves who had to work in the fields cutting the sugarcane and the ones loading and processing it in those mills we saw in the picture in the previous lesson. Okay, now there were some slaves above them who had more privileges, who were called overseers. So these were slaves who would be given a role in like managing the other slaves by the plantation owners. So they would tend to get slightly better food, maybe slightly better accommodation. Um, at the top of the sort of slave hierarchy was really the domestic slaves. So the domestic slaves were the ones who got to work in the house. And the reason that was obviously a more privileged position is it was a lot less dangerous than working in the fields, and it was a lot less physically exhausting than field work. Okay, so within the slaves themselves, there is this hierarchy. Now, above this line here, these people are no longer slaves. Okay, now the group above the slaves in the hierarchy were the free coloreds. Okay, now free coloreds could be made free by their owners, either by being paid off by themselves. They'd save up money to then free themselves, or sometimes they'd be released. So not all of them were mixed race. Some of them were actually Africans who managed to somehow save up enough money to pay for their freedom, or like in the case of Toussaint, were released by their owner because of their good service. But most of the free colors were mulattoes, okay, mixed race people who were born free. So these people are called the free coloreds, okay, so they are above the slaves and they are not slaves themselves. And then above them, the white population can be really divided up into two main groups. You have the petit blancs, remember French petit means small. So these would be whites who were shopkeepers, carpenters, teachers. So not the big plantation owners, but they were white and they weren't enslavable. So they were, more privileged than the African slaves were. And at the very top of the social hierarchy, you had the grand blancs. Remember, grand meaning large, okay, or big. So these were like the top sort of rulers of the island, and they were the big owners of the plantations that owned most of the slaves. And it would include things like lawyers and doctors and the really wealthy professionals. Now, critics of this system called it in France the aristocracy of the skin. Now, that expression came from the idea that in France, there was also a social hierarchy, but it was based really upon land ownership. Okay, so the aristocracy were the big landowners, and society was structured in a way that gave them the most power. The idea of calling it the aristocracy of the skin was to say, in France, your privilege in the hierarchy is based upon your ownership of land. Over here, it's based on the color of your skin. Okay, so it's an aristocracy of the skin. So French revolutionary critics of the system in Saint-Domingue called it the aristocracy of the skin for that reason. Now, the French Revolution starts, as you'll know from last half term, in 1789, and it has a really important impact on events in Saint-Domingue and Haiti because the ideas travel there and then they have a really explosive impact on the island. Okay, now the most famous sort of document, the French Revolution, is this one, which is called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. So when the French Revolution began and the National Assembly formed, this was the document which basically declared the aims of the French Revolution. And the most famous one is Article 1, where it declared that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Okay, so men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Now, that idea obviously undermined the aristocracy of the skin in Saint-Domingue, because if all people were born free and remained free and equal, then that obviously was a real challenge to this system of social hierarchy. Okay, so that belief in equality that came with the French Revolution was actually extremely destabilizing to events in Saint-Domingue. Okay, I would strongly recommend that in the video next down in the playlist, 3.2, there's a really, really good short 2-minute video that talks about the impact of the rights of man on the aristocracy of the skin. So I'd watch that if I were you after watching this one. Now, we're going to look at just a quick story about one very famous free colored man called Julien Raymond. Okay, so we're just going to go through it, and you're going to have at the end of this a little worksheet to do with a few questions about Raymond. Okay, so I'm just going to talk you through that now. So Julien Raymond was born a free man of color, the son of a white French planter, so remember the ones who owned the plantations, and a free black mother in 1744. In the 1760s, he traveled to France to become the first man of color to study at one of France's best universities. By 1780, he had worked to become one of the wealthiest men of color in the whole of Saint-Domingue as an indigo farmer. Now, if we think about what's significant about his story so far, so what's important about it? So he's a free colored man. He's one of the first people to go to the École Normale Supérieure, which is like the equivalent of Cambridge or Oxford in France. So again, he's one of the first non-white people to go there. So that's clearly a really important, big achievement that he's one of the first men of color to be able to do that. And he also becomes one of the wealthiest men of color in the whole of Saint-Domingue, and he does that by being an indigo farmer. So the indigo is what you use to dye clothes blue. Okay, so he had these indigo farms, which he used to become one of the wealthiest men of color. So again, he stood out at the time. Now, if we carry on with this story, he had other achievements. So in the 1780s, Raymond began to use his education and power to campaign for the French government to end the laws that allowed racial discrimination against the free colors in Saint-Domingue. When the French Revolution began in 1789, he moved to France. He worked with white French radicals to pass the first laws to guarantee free coloreds civil rights in 1791. Whites in Saint-Domingue refused to recognize these new rights and began a civil war against the men of color like Raymond. Okay, so we're thinking about what's significant about his story now. Well, he goes to France and gets this elite education, but he then uses it to campaign against the laws of racial discrimination that existed in Saint-Domingue. Okay, so he campaigned to end the laws that discriminated against the free colors in Saint-Domingue. He didn't think that the aristocracy of the skin was fair. He thought that free colored men like himself should have the same equal rights as other white citizens in Saint-Domingue. And he then campaigned in 1791 to get the law changed in France so that the laws in Saint-Domingue would reflect the equality that he wanted. But the whites in Saint-Domingue kind of rebel against that order and refuse to carry it out. But we'll kind of get into that a bit more next time. Now, this kind of will add a bit more complication to Raymond as a figure there. Right, Raymond, like many of the free coloreds he was defending, also owned black slaves. His wealth came from his indigo plantations, where he owned over 150 black slaves. Like other free coloreds before the revolution, he also served in the maréchaussée, the colony's militia whose main job was to capture runaway slaves. During the Haitian Revolution, he became one of Toussaint Louverture's leading advisors and allies. He was one of the three people to write Haiti's constitution and Declaration of Independence when it broke away from France in 1803. Now, a question you're going to have to answer at the end of that worksheet is, on balance, do you think Raymond deserves to be remembered as a heroic figure? And the reason that's obviously a complicated idea is that Raymond clearly is a quite, an extraordinary individual, right? He's born into a very racist society, but he goes to an elite French university. He becomes one of the richest men of color in the whole colony. He then campaigns to get the laws changed to give equal rights to the free colored men like himself on the island. But on the other hand, he also himself owned black slaves. So he owned, despite being a mixed race man of color, he owned 150 slaves. And he also served in the militia whose job was to capture runaway slaves. Um, and that shows you the kind of complication in Saint-Domingue. It wasn't just a simple case of white slave owners and then black African slaves. You had these middle groups made up of people like Raymond and the free coloreds who occupied a kind of middle position. And despite being what we would consider to be mixed race today, he saw himself as being of the same class as the white slave owners. So his father was a white slave owner, and he in many ways saw himself in the same sort of way. So again, a question for you to debate. Do you think on balance he should be remembered as a heroic figure? He also then later on, once the revolution did actually start, he did join Toussaint and fight with the slaves against France, and he helped to write Haiti's Declaration of Independence. So a complicated man, an interesting one. Okay, so you've got a little worksheet to do on that at the end. Now, there's then a very second short video about why free colours like Raymond were the first people in Saint-Domingue to demand equality. And the real reason for that is that if we think about where they are in the social hierarchy, right, the reason they're kind of like the first people to demand equality when the French Revolution begins is they've kind of got the education and power to stand up for themselves. So when the sort of news of the French Revolution spreads to Saint-Domingue, it initially creates a kind of civil war between the free coloured men like Raymond and the Petit and Grand Blancs. Okay, so it's really a civil war between these two. It's only later on that the slaves themselves come into the picture and start demanding rights for themselves as well. Okay, so there's just two things that you have to do now that you've watched this video. Okay, the first thing is that you've got this little worksheet here. I'll show you just as a PDF and show my homework. So you need to you've got, so the story of Raymond there, you've got 5 questions to answer about him and that challenge question about, do you think he deserves to be remembered as a heroic figure or not? So you need to complete that worksheet and send it back to your teacher. So you can either type that or handwrite it and send a picture, but that is on Show My Homework as a Word document or a PDF. You can do either one. So that's the first thing, do that worksheet. The second one is you've got a 15-question quiz on Show My Homework, and that has to be done by Friday as well. Okay, so do those 2 things, and then you're done for this week. And the next week, we're going to be looking at the beginning of the revolution in Haiti.